Oh,
Okay.
great. Now we're in trouble, dude. You can be incriminated.
Okay, it's going to be short, about 20 minutes. So, Anthony, you want to go first? Just
Yeah, so thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us in this interview today. So I'm pretty sure both of you were kind of briefed on what we're going to be talking about today, but just to give like a brief summary, we're just going to discuss kind of like the fatherhood situation in your family. So what we're trying to do here is kind of explore the relationships kind of between the fathers and their children in kind of like Korean as well as other East Asian kind of environments, and also kind of compare them with what's happening in Western families. And I heard that your family has a really unique situation in which you guys have this like Western traditions and Western culture, but at the same time, you guys also have a lot of experience with like Japanese and like Korean cultures. So we thought it would be really interesting to talk with you guys today. And we did send some sample questions that are going to be really similar to what we're going to ask you today. So just to like start it off, could you just like tell us your maybe your background or how your upbringing was, Mr. Smith?
Well, me,
Yeah.
my background. So I'm originally from the US. I grew up in Chicago until middle school and then moved to Southern California. I have seven brothers, um, no sisters, and I grew up in, all American and, very, shall we say, strict household, very religious. Um, and, we had very, let's say, strong rules and structure in my house growing up. And my father was kind of more of an authoritarian figure than like a friend, if you're talking about fatherhood. Um, yeah. So more, yeah, and very much more like disciplinarian than I would say, um, like relatable, if that makes sense.
So we've interviewed Steven, my dad, and Anthony's father. And so we're basically like, as Anthony explained, we're trying to like look at the cultural differences between like fatherhood, like with people with different backgrounds. So could you just quickly explain like how you got to Japan and Korea, like that process really briefly?
Yeah. So I first went to Korea when I was 19 years old, and I went as a missionary. And so I was there for 2 years, living in the countryside, like Gyeonggi-do, and but like Gyeonggi-do, like 시골, not Suwon or something like this. It was I was more in the countryside, and I was there for 2 years. I learned Korean, became familiar with Korean culture during that time, ate a lot of spicy food, got addicted to kimchi, and then moved back to the States, went to college, but there was lots of Koreans at my college, like your dad, so I kept speaking Korean. And then after I graduated college, moved back to Korea to work, and lived there another 3 years. I worked for Hyundai, and then moved back to the States. Oh, and then I moved around a lot. Then I moved to Switzerland for a while, and then I got a job in Japan. That was 20 years ago. So then I got married and moved to Japan in 2005. And then we basically have lived in Japan for the most of the last 20 years. And Kai and all my kids were born in Japan. So my wife's American, but as you said, my kids were born and raised in Japan. So they speak Japanese. They went to Japanese school, basically until middle school. Um, and we also lived in Hong Kong for 3 years. And during that time, the kids still went to Japanese school in Hong Kong. Sorry about that, bro. And yeah, and then we lived in the States during COVID for 3 years. So we've kind of had a little bit of an international journey where, I lived in a bunch of different countries as an adult, but I would say, Kai's lived in a bunch of different countries, as a kid growing up, if that makes sense.
could Kai also like shortly introduce himself? Like,
Yeah, sure. So, as he said, I was born in Japan. I attended Japanese public school for all of elementary school, so until the end of sixth grade. Then after that, well, I mean, we also lived in Hong Kong, but it was still Japanese school. So like my friends were all Japanese, just people living there in Hong Kong. And then for seventh, eighth, wait, no, half of sixth, seventh, and then eighth grade, then I lived in Tennessee, just out like Nashville, but a bit more outskirts. So I lived in the US for 3 years. That's like completely different than Japan. But then after that, for ninth grade until now, I moved back and I go to international school now.
So one thing that I kind of like heard that was really interesting for me was Mr. Smith, you said that your kind of childhood, your relationship with your father, your general family kind of dynamic was a bit more kind of like more stricter. You guys had like religion was a big part of your kind of family, and you mentioned that your father was more of a disciplinarian. And I think that's like what people think like the stereotypical Korean family is. Like East Asia is like the dad is this like big authoritative figure that has this like these strict laws that they enforce. With your knowledge on like kind of like East Asian kind of family cultures, like would you kind of elaborate on like the similarities and differences between your experience with your own kind of like stricter father compared to what people believe these like strict East Asian fathers kind of are? Like, are there any differences, similarities?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I don't, you know, proclaim that I understand, kind of Korean fatherhood perfectly. I didn't grow up in Korea or in a Korean household. I mean, I only know from, things I hear from my Korean friends or what I saw when I lived in Korea. So, the comparisons I make probably aren't perfect. But I would say, some of the differences that I did see is, my father, while strict and disciplinarian, still had a very active role in the house. Meaning he did a lot of housework. He was around a lot. So my understanding is, Korean fathers tend to work a lot or be out of the house, a lot, but my dad was around a lot. So he was there quite a bit and, like cleaning the house or doing chores around the house or, fixing things around the house was very much, my father's kind of wheelhouse. Um, but that was also involved, him telling us what to do around the house, which from my understanding more on the Korean side, the mother tends to run the house and the dad kind of floats in and out, based on work. But I would say in the American experience, kind of, let's say the house is shared, between the parents, where, both parents have kind of very clear responsibilities for raising children. Whereas I also understand like Korean, the moms tend to be, very much involved in the child's education and basically responsible for it. But I would say in the American house, it's shared. And so, I wouldn't say my mom had more guidance on my academics than my father did. It's probably actually more my father than my mom. Asking me if my homework's done and blah, 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 and what have I done? It's probably more my dad asking those questions than my mom, which I think is a little bit different. And, in America, they don't tend to work so late, which means my dad was typically home, like 5 o'clock, this kind of thing, which means he was home basically the whole time I was there, in the afternoons after sports and all this, which I also understand is not the case in Korea. So I think that was the main difference is just kind of the active role of my father in the household versus what I understand, happens in Korea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I've also seen that with some of my American friends too, because I lived in the States for like 5 years and I have this Korean American friend and his father is also like a pretty like strict figure, but I noticed that he also plays like a really involved role in the house. And like you said about like your own father, my friend's father also is the one that's like really involved with his grades, his like school life. So I think like a really like noticeable and interesting difference is the fact that kind of Korean households are a bit more divided in terms of tradition, whereas American households, even if it's like still very strict, it's more kind of like shared. and like the responsibilities are kind of distributed even. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's clear expectations in the US for husbands to, do housework, for instance, right? And there's clear expectations, even of the wife, like she expects her husband to like wash dishes or make food every now and then, or, clean the house, right? Um, and so there is kind of a view of shared responsibility in the house, in the States, that I think is a bit different than more traditional Asian roles, like even Japan. Um, yeah.
Hmm.
And so, you don't feel like there's a clear division of labor in the household. Like both parents are kind of around all the time. It just depends. But because of that, because there's not a clear tradition, each household in the States, I think, is very, very different. Um, because there isn't kind of 1,000 years of history of, how parents act in the household, like in Japan, like in Korea. It's, America's a young country, right? With a lot of immigrants. And so people bring their own culture, into the house, but they're varied, right? I mean, as you know, we have Korean households in the States, we have Japanese households, we have Chinese households, we have Mexican, we have, Iranian, whatever. And so there isn't like a clear definition of what's the kind of expectation in the house in America. It really, and each house can be very different, can have a very different culture, just depending on kind of what, the parents decide together or how they interact together. Um, and kind of what ends up happening rather than a kind of society expectation or let's say, a grandparent's expectation. There's really not a lot of that. And so even in the States, it's not uncommon to have like fathers stay at home and the mom goes to work, which I really can't even imagine in Japan or Korea. Like people would think that's so weird. But in the States, it's not seen as weird. Now, it's not the majority, but the point is it exists and it's not seen as weird. Which I think is very different than my experience in Asia.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned about you yourself going through like a pretty strict parenting style back in the States. Do you think you continue to like parent your children in that kind of way, or did it shift a little as you stayed in Japan for a long
Well,
time?
I mean, this guy can answer that question better than me, but at least from my perspective, it's night and day. Um, yeah, it's night and day. But I think that's also generational. I think, moving outside of culture, I think parenting styles in general in the States, have changed a lot. And so, the way that baby boomers raise when my parents are baby boomers, raise their kids is very different than today, where, like I'm Gen X. And so there was always, when you're raised Gen X in the States, there was always a kind of a tension between, children and their parents. Like it always existed. And like kids would literally, really try and avoid their parents, because there was just a friction in the relationship, and it's normal. And there's, if you watch 80s movies, which I'm not saying you should, a lot of those kind of teenage movies were about kind of parental child conflicts and dealing with those. Um, but I would say today is a kind of, like, say, a generational shift. There tends to be more of personal relationships with children, more kind of casual talk with children, more understanding, and, kind of like, he calls me bro, right? Like that would never happen in my house. Like if I called my dad bro, oh my gosh, I would have gotten killed. But there's more, I would say, a relation that exists that didn't exist. Now it doesn't mean we're friends. I mean, I love him to death, but I'm still his dad, and my job is still, to help him see opportunities, to give him opportunities, to help him grow, but also tell him when he's not doing things the right way. Um, but I also grew up with like violence in my home, which doesn't really exist today in my home. And so I would say, but this is also generational. Like that stuff is gone away, whereas it used to be, quite normal and prevalent, if that makes sense.
Oh, what do you think are some personal or like societal kind of factors that influence you to kind of have a little bit more different and perhaps a more casual relationship with your like sons and children?
I mean, you learn a lot through your own experience, right? So, again, in American households, there's not a clear cultural expectation, right? And so because of that, you can shape your house how you want. Not perfectly, but a lot more easily than, say, a Japanese house or a Korean house. Um, and so you learn like, what did I not like as a kid? Like, what are the things that my dad did that I hated? And I try not to do those things. On the flip side, what are the things that, they did that I really liked? And I try and magnify those things. So, you know, you, as a parent, you can really choose what kind of parent you want to be. Um, but you also find that, each of your children is unique and, they each have different needs and approaches, as individuals, rather than kind of one strict parenting style. Like Kai, I don't need to parent very much because the guy's so good and mature. But he's got a little sister who's 6, who's like, oh my gosh, she needs help. She needs help. But yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the thing about American parenting is it's very easy to change your style without coming up against like societal expectations or cultural expectations, if that makes sense.
So I want to ask Kai if like he's noticed any differences because like you probably have visited like your Japanese friends' house or like have seen their parenting style. Do you recognize any like significant differences between like parenting or like thing you get at your place and your friend's place?
Um, Actually, now I think about it, every time I go to my friend's house, their parents aren't usually really there. Like, they're, I mean, usually, like, as my dad said, like, their dads usually work a lot more and, like, or like they're out longer or like kept back longer in Japan than it is with like the US per se. But, like, in that way, too, I guess they're not quite around there as much. Like, their mom is usually more like watching over them, helping them with school assignments, things like that. Um, I don't know otherwise. I mean, they're just generally nicer or like it's really like Japan is like manner or like respect oriented. So it's like when you come in, then you're like respectful. They'll like make oyatsu or like snacks there too for you guys if like friends are over and they'll be nice to them. So like I guess there's that thing like the culture of having guests around and they'll treat differently. Like,
Oh, Kai, you mentioned earlier that you saw a big difference in like between your life in Japan and your life in Tennessee. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
yeah, so that's just both school and cultural differences between like Japanese elementary school and then like just Tennessee middle school out in the US. But one, I guess, is just the people. There's both like pros and cons each side, but like the US, they're a lot more open. So like a lot more talkative. They have like extracurriculars, things like that. They'll go out and do. But then at the same time, I guess Japanese are more like study oriented, more serious about that. While Tennessee, it's like, hey, which Chick-fil-A do you want to go to? Do you want to go to like this park out there? Something like that. But yeah, that too. And then also, I guess US, there's more like social expectations when you're like a kid there in middle school. It's like there's trends you have to keep up with, things like that, that I feel like isn't really as much in Japan. Like Japan, if you have like a group of people, you're just somewhat nice enough. They're like, yeah, okay, cool. And there's no really like, I mean, I guess there's like popular kids, but it isn't really the same way as like the US would be. US a lot more like trends and like that whole influence going around too.
So, guess another thing I wanted to ask is, n- I mean, you probably haven't experienced like Korean parenting style. Like, you've seen my dad like parent me in some kind of way, but it was more a little westernized. do you think there's any difference between like the Japanese parenting style and Korean parenting style you experience? Like, it's a question to both of you.
I'm a little of Korean.
Yeah, I don't know
A
that.
little bit.
Well, probably you have
I
Korean
have
friends.
Nathan, yeah, but I don't really, yeah.
Yeah, I think, the biggest difference in kind of Korean parenting style versus Japanese, versus US is, the real focus on education in Korea,
Hmm.
like to the point of, I'll just say it, like craziness. Like it's not rational. But somewhere in Korean history, not a long time ago, but probably in the last 30, 40 years, there was some decision that, education was the most important thing, period. And but then I think the parents took that as their kind of purpose of being is their child's education. And I think that's what's unique about Korea is the kind of mania, around education for kids to the point where even parents will have a self-identity based on their child's educational achievements, which to Westerners or even to Japanese is really odd. Meaning, you have a parent that their self-identity is based on their children, which is very odd for us because our self-identity is our self-identity, and my child is his own person. I'm proud of him, or I'm not proud of him, one or the other, but he's his own person. But I don't change my kind of confidence or how I feel in a social structure, based on the performance or non-performance of my child. Whereas at least my impression is, that in Korea, there's a very strong pride around, oh, my son's at Seoul University or my daughter's at Princeton, and they're bragging about this. Whereas, like, usually Westerners or Japanese won't even talk about that. Um, I mean, you would never say it, like, unless somebody really asked you, like, because it's not really your business. Like, that's my child's achievement. And so I think that's the biggest difference I see. And I remember when I was first in Korea, looking at like high school seniors, that were only sleeping kind of 3, 4 hours a night, getting ready for tests, and this kind of thing. And I remember being very shocked um, at that. Obviously I saw it as kind of unhealthy, um, but it was also driving home, I guess, the importance of this test, to a lot of Korean homes and families, which you don't see in the States. You don't see that in Japan. I mean, yeah, SAT is important, but it's like heaven and earth difference level between, kind of the what I saw in Korea, right? Um, and in the U.S., parents don't really push education as much. Um, they tend to push even sports more than education, I would say, right? And kind of extracurricular activities, you know, and that was my learning in Tennessee is like sports was way more important than academics, which I think is just very, very different because I think in Korea, academics are number one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10. And then if you do sports, you better be like an Olympic athlete, right? So that's what I saw as the biggest difference, as far as kind of values in the home, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And since we are kind of reaching the 30-minute point, I think as maybe like a final or concluding question, uh, what's your understanding of kind of like the Korean or Japanese kind of parenting style, as in like a bit more maybe strict, maybe a bit more focused on education, what you know, basically. Do you think there are any elements to that that you think is valuable or that you use yourself in your own parenting ways that you approach to your children?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the Japanese parenting style is different than Korean. It's different than the US, of course, right? It's unique. But there's a core central value in Japan of just hard work. And so I would say in Japan, the value that's taught in the homes, but in society as well, is just do your best. But there's also a respect that everybody's best is different, meaning that, some people are born gifted and, have superior IQs. And, if they work hard, they'll go on to achieve certain things. But Japanese don't really care about that. Like nobody in Japan talks about their kid going to Tokyo University or, the top schools here. Zero people talk about that. Like zero. You would never. I mean, it's kind of a secret. But the value they're teaching in their home is really just do your best. And so there is, but so that still does create a kind of cultural pressure, do your best. It means, that they don't want their kids to be lazy or sitting around or not doing things. They want their kids to be active and engaged, but doing their best. And I would say that's Japan. And Japan is not an achievement culture. There's not a kind of comparison with other people. So they don't feel competitive with others, which sounds weird to you, I know, but it's true. And so they're more competitive with themselves. Did they do their best? And so I think parents' expectation of their children as well is, did you do your best? And if there's failure, it is a, hey, I don't know that you did your best there, rather than, no, no, she peso, like you would never hear that in Japan. So I think that's something that's unique in Japan. Whereas in the States, a lot of it is kind of who the child is and their self-motivation. And then the parents kind of encourage that self-motivation. So if my kid wants to go to Yale or Seoul University, I'll support him. But he wants to go. That's why I'm supporting him, not I want him to go, if that makes sense. And that's more the American style. Does that make sense? And I think, I mean, you understand Korean style, so you can compare kind of how those differences exist.
I think it's definitely interesting how even between like Korean and Japanese cultures, which people tend to think are like really similar, it's like there's still like a noticeable difference between how they approach
Yeah, it's
families.
night and day. And, that was my biggest, I mean, my first experience obviously was in Korea. But when I moved to Japan, it was, really shocking about, how different it was, from Korea, even though the countries are next to each other. Um, and, they're both beautiful places, with both have, amazing highlights and, great things about them. Just very different, right?
Yeah.
Just as the US has good things and bad things, Japan has good things and bad things, Korea has good things, they're just all different, right? So I can't sit here and tell you, that one style is better than the other. It really depends, I think, on the individual and the family. And, sometimes it works out great for the kids, sometimes it doesn't. But as we discussed earlier, the most important thing is that we as individuals are learning so that when we're adults, we've learned from our experience and we change and we do a better job than our parents did. And I think that's what our parents would like us to do ultimately, is improve, kind of generation to generation to generation, rather than maintain a cultural expectation because it's a cultural expectation.
Hmm. Yeah. And so I think that sums up all the questions that we wanted you guys to answer today. So
Cool.
yeah, I'll pause the recording.